good. Simon, you had a question?
Yeah, I sort of touched on it a little bit when you were talking about the gorillas and the chimps. And I was just wondering about homosexual sex in, I guess, in primates. Is it a function of sexual dimorphism, or gorillas not having homosexual sex because the males and the females are so different? Or is there something more to it?
Okay, so the question is, the observation is that chimpanzees have homosexual sex and gorillas do not. Gorillas are very sexually dimorphic and chimpanzees are not. Are those two observations related?
I think they are, because if another male gorilla comes over, he's going to beat the heck out of him. So there's really no opportunity for it. So the social systems are pretty different between gorillas and chimpanzees. Chimpanzees are actually much more social in terms of interacting with other members of their group, whereas gorillas, they're not going to interact in the same way. I think there's less opportunity in gorilla society than there is in chimpanzee society.
Sorry, can you expand that beyond just primates? So would that apply to other mammals or animals?
So the question is, can this apply to other animals? I am not. So you would mean if in other animals you had those differences in the way, for lack of a better word, their societies worked, if that would also be correlated with homosexual behavior. I would expect it to be, but I don't know that. We know that homosexual behavior is common in a diversity of animals. We know that it's usually not exclusive, however. But what I would expect is if you have something where it's like a big male and he's chasing off all the other males, that there's not going to be certainly male-male homosexuality. And I don't know if anybody's ever looked for female-female homosexuality in those societies. I'm unaware of that data.
Let's go here and then down. Okay, yeah, in the middle.
I'm just wondering if there's the same type of choice or decision making in also in homosexual situations in humans. If female homosexuals are more choosy than males or vice versa.
Good question. So if we take as the base that males and females differ in their level of choosiness in the human species, does that choosiness then extend to homosexuals of the different sexes? Or the difference?
So I don't know about choosiness per se, but in some data that I've seen on homosexuality, and I think to some extent this is just so stories because I haven't read extensively on it, I'm not aware of all the research, but the things that I came across when I was preparing for this presentation suggests that promiscuous serial relationships are more common, self-reported, in male homosexuals than in female homosexuals, suggesting differences in choosiness. But that's the only, I've only seen one study, so I don't want to say that I'm the authority on that.
Yep. No, behind you. Then you.
Now that women are better educated and have control of reproduction, which they didn't have in the past, and we see birth rates dropping, and the woman probably can command enough resources to raise a child by herself. Can we project ahead as to what kind of society we're going towards and how many of us are going to be around?
This gets back to what are males for. So if we assume that that global climate change isn't going to kill everybody, then in humans, females have more access to resources, and to the extent they can even start raising children on their own generally, will that change the selection on males and females in the arena of sexual selection?
So some of the things that I read suggest that this may already be happening. So if you remember that sociosexual index stuff, it suggested that in societies where women have more power, that women are similarly promiscuous to men. So the idea from a sexual behavior point of view is that we would become more promiscuous as a species as women have greater power. I read things that, and I'll get them wrong if I try to do it, but like talking about fashion and women's body types and trying to relate all of this to the power, the economic power that women had. But I think that's separate from what it takes to raise a child. And I think that, a free love society where we don't have pair bonds is not something that I would want to stand here and predict is going to happen. Because evolutionarily, we know that that doesn't work for the raising of children.
And the other thing to keep in mind there, I think, is that, again, the timescales. So cultures and societies turn over at a much faster rate than allele frequencies change. So projecting the future is not, in terms of what may take place, won't say anything about which traits or which alleles are going to be increasing in frequency. I think it's always important to remember. Yes, sir?
I'm wondering if a particular environment containing, a certain quality or quantity of hormone could affect a person's sex drive. Is there any evidence, say in an industrial society like ours, where chemicals or a beautiful setting of the park can really have the opposite sort of thing?
So the general question is, to what extent does our environment, our local environment, like where you are, what you're smelling, what you're eating, actually affect your sexual behavior? Is that a fair? Sex drive. Does it affect a sex drive?
So unfortunately, I don't know the answer to the sex drive part of the question, but I do know that more hormones in our environment are leading to changes in when we go through puberty. We tend to think of societies, from even several hundred years ago, not to mention pre-modern societies, as having young people go through puberty younger than we do today. That's actually not the case. Today, we see that young girls are going through puberty 5 or 6 years earlier than they did just 200 or 300 years ago. And the idea there is that it has to do with hormones that get into our environment because of all the women who are taking birth control pills and then flushing the toilet. What that means for sex drives, I don't know, but we know that this affects not only humans but other animals in our environment, and it's of great concern to environmental biologists.
Yes, here.
In polygamous societies, it seems that production of sons would be a bit of a waste since a large number of them wouldn't get to reproduce. And is there any evidence of any sort of selection in any animals towards a skewed birth rate, producing more daughters than sons?
Okay, so in harem-type societies or societies with very strong female choice where some males get most of the matings and most males get none of the matings, yes? Then the idea being is that generally producing males is a waste. Am I, yeah? And so is there any evidence for changing of the sex ratio in those species? And the background fact, of course, is that in humans, the sex ratio is 1-to-1. It's pretty close to 1-to-1.
Yeah, at birth. Yeah, the sex ratio in humans is 1-to-1 at birth, although it tends to get females skewed by puberty because, past, like so by the 20s, because more young men tend to die under violent circumstances. I want to separate polygamy in humans from in animals because again, if we go back to Arna's great comment before, in societies we expect those to have a turnover rate that's much shorter than the scale that we would talk about in evolutionary sense. So what about in animals? I'm actually not aware of that for polygamous species, but it's been shown that there are cases where females can adjust the sex ratio of their offspring. And this tends to be related to things like her own body's characters. So if a female deer is in really good shape and she's had plenty to eat, she might be more likely to produce sons. We're still trying to understand the mechanism behind this. In many deer species, larger size matters more for males than for females because those males are fighting for mates. And so what we see is the ability to adjust the sex of offspring, not just in deer, but in several other species. The question is whether this would happen over time scales where we could study it. But I would say that it's likely to be fluctuating over a short enough time scale that we might miss it. Okay, because it would probably be determined very much by local circumstances. Obviously, producing no males isn't going to work. And if you're a female in good condition, producing a really good male that might get all those girls and get all those matings, that would be great for your fitness, right? So always, producing a balanced sex ratio over time actually makes evolutionary sense.
Right. So another way of thinking about that is that if you can choose what type of male offspring to have, then you should, and you have control, then you should, if you can make a good one, make it. If you don't, make a female. But if you don't have that choice, then the best chance is to make equal numbers of boys and girls in your offspring.